Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. First of all, thank you to anyone who joined me on Blue Sky or Facebook for my January in Japan short story reading project. I hadn't expected for my personal project to take off in quite that way, but it was really fun to share it with all of you. If you're still interested in participating or reading those stories, all of which are available to read for free online, you can find information on the Read Japanese Literature website. But the real story today is how excited I am because in today's episode, for the first time ever, I'm bringing you information I learned in a live interview I got to conduct myself with a Japanese author. Columbia University Press and the Japan Foundation New York graciously helped organize an interview between myself and Akutagawa-winning author Keiichiro Hirano in November of last year. Hirano was kind enough to share more than an hour of his time talking about his work via interpreter Mari Morimoto. In the future, I'd love to find a way to include actual recorded content from authors or translators. For today, you can find a transcript of our discussion on the RJL website. I've enjoyed almost all of Hirano's work in English, which includes A Man, translated by Eli K.P. William, At the End of the Matinee, translated by Juliet Winters Carpenter, and Transparent Labyrinth, translated by Karim Yassar. But I absolutely loved Hirano's first novel, the most recently translated into English, Eclipse, and it was translated by Brent Deschênes and Charles de Wolfe. So today, we'll be discussing Hirano's life and work. We'll be discussing the influence of author Yukio Mishima on Hirano's life and his research on Yukio Mishima, and we'll end with a discussion of Eclipse. Eclipse takes place in medieval France, and the protagonist is a Dominican friar. I did my master's degree on the intersection between medieval literature and medieval Catholic theology, so this is right up my alley. Just a warning now, there will be spoilers in our discussion of Eclipse, but I'm saving some of the novel's best secrets for you to discover for yourself. A quick content warning. There'll be a brief mention of attempted suicide and a discussion of Yukio Mishima's The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Keiichiro Hirano was born in 1975. That's a year before Mieko Kawakami and 4 years before Tomihiko Morimi, both authors we've covered on the podcast. Hirano was born in Gamagori, a city along Japan's eastern coast, closer to Osaka than Tokyo. It's about 3 hours from Tokyo by train. Hirano was a more or less typical Japanese student. He would have entered elementary school when he was around 7 years old, say 1983. He would have entered middle school in, say, 1989, and he would have graduated high school in, say, 1992. After he graduated from high school, Hirano entered the prestigious Kyoto University to study law. To understand Hirano's life and work, you'll need a little more context about what it means to have been born in Japan and to graduate from high school in the early 1990s. To keep a long story short, the 1980s were Japan's bubble era. You can learn a lot more about the bubble era in RJL's Season 1 episode, Banana and the Bubble. Low interest rates contributed to a real estate asset bubble. This should sound familiar to English speakers old enough to remember 2008. According to some estimates, by 1989, the land in Tokyo was worth more than all the real estate in the entire United States combined. But by the end of 1989, the real estate bubble burst, and the economy never really recovered. By never, I mean that Japan today in 2025 is still not at the levels of prosperity it saw in the late 1980s. In the early 1990s, industrial production and construction fell off a cliff. The rest of the decade wasn't much better. The people of Japan found out how corrupt many of their politicians were. Japan's export economy collapsed. Its economic growth disappeared. Unemployment skyrocketed. Wages plummeted. And then in 1995, an earthquake in Kobe killed more than 5,000 people. Not long afterward, an act of terrorism on the Tokyo Underground killed 27 people and injured thousands more. The economic depression, the earthquake, and the terrorism caused some serious soul-searching in Japan. We'll come back to the ways these events are thematically important to Eclipse later in the episode. But for right now, let me just say that some people inside and outside of Japan call the 1990s Japan's lost decade, and the people who are Hirano's age, the lost generation. These men and women graduated from high school or college into what has become known as the employment ice age, a period of low employment and frozen hiring that lasted from about 1994 to about 2004. People who graduated during the employment ice age would have been born in the early 1970s through the mid-1980s. Most Japanese companies tend to hire career track workers straight out of college. It's a system called the simultaneous recruiting of new graduates. In the 90s and early aughts, new grads who had prepped for careers for the first 20-something years of their lives graduated with almost no prospects. Much like American millennials who graduated in the late aughts, some of these graduates have never made up for their career losses. You can learn more about how the end of the bubble era affected other groups in Japan in RJL's episode Writing About Japan's Have-Nots. But let's return to Hirano and rewind in his life just a little bit. One of the ways in which Hirano wasn't a typical Japanese student was his desire to write. As a kid, Hirano didn't love reading. He preferred being outside, especially playing baseball or soccer. But, like many of us, he hit puberty and became a lot more introspective. He describes it as, quote, looking at his own identity and really formulating his own personality. Hirano was also influenced by his father's early death. Like many of us who lost someone close when we were still young, Hirano started thinking about death and mortality pretty early too. It was in this context, and with these sorts of thoughts and ideas in mind, that 14-year-old Hirano discovered Yukio Mishima's The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Full disclosure, I've read Ivan Morris's English language translation of The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. It's almost certainly my least favorite Mishima novel, but I recognize that Mishima was a genius, and there certainly are Mishima novels I admire, so I'll do my best to give a charitable discussion of The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion was originally published in 1956. It's loosely based on the real-life burning of the famous Deer Garden Temple, much more famously called the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. It's a real temple in Kyoto, originally built in 1397. In real life, a 22-year-old novice monk burned the temple down on July 2nd, 1950, before he attempted suicide. He was later sentenced to 7 years in prison. Mishima actually visited the novice in prison while he was drafting his novel. The novice was freed in 1955 because he was mentally ill. He was schizophrenic, and he died of tuberculosis less than a year later in March 1956. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion itself was rebuilt in 1955. That's why tourists can go and visit the Temple of the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto. It is, however, one of Kyoto's most crowded tourist sites. If you're planning a trip to Japan, be forewarned. Mishima makes a fictionalized novice monk the protagonist of his novel. This fictionalized novice grows up almost fetishizing, really, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion as the most beautiful building in the world. But he's never seen it. This young man is poor, he stutters, he has no friends. This novice finally sees the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. He fantasizes about its destruction on and off, including during the American firebombings of World War II. Those firebombings ultimately spared Kyoto. The young man also has some really not very admirable character growth, I suppose. Given that this novel is based on true historical events, I don't think I'm spoiling anything when I reveal the protagonist eventually does burn down the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. The novel ends with the protagonist's decision not to kill himself. 14-year-old Keiichiro Hirano found himself drawn to Mishima's protagonist, although not necessarily admiring him. He too felt isolated from his peers. And Hirano was also moved by the novel itself, by what he described to me as the contrast between the beautiful rhetoric of the novel and the very dark character and the negative internal confessions of the character. These kinds of strong contrasts, light, dark, beauty, ugliness, drew him to the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, and then to the rest of Mishima's work, and through Mishima, to the rest of literature. These kinds of contrasts also come up in some of Hirano's later writing. They definitely come up in Eclipse. Hirano started writing Eclipse, his first novel, when he was just 20 years old. He published it when he was 21 in the literary journal Shincho. This was a pretty normal way to publish a novel in Japan. For example, all Akutagawa winners are pulled from work published in Japan's literary journals. Hirano himself won the Akutagawa for Eclipse in 1998. I'm going to talk about the Akutagawa Prize for just a moment. This may be review, so to speak, for some of you. We have covered the Akutagawa Prize in an episode called The Akutagawa Prize and Kobo Abe. But the Akutagawa Prize is a big deal. It's rewarded twice annually, almost every year, to an author of great promise writing literary fiction. Akutagawa winning stories are much more likely to make money for publishers than most literary fiction. These stories are likely to get republished many times. Akutagawa winning stories appear in magazines at least twice by default. The first appearance before winning, and then the second after winning. They're always reprinted in the Bungei Shunju, the literary journal that sponsors the prize. They're then printed as tonkobon, or standalone books. Tonkobon is something like the Japanese market equivalent of an English language hardcover. The most popular titles get reprinted as bunkobon, inexpensive, small format paperbacks. Going from tonkobon to bunkobon is something like English language hardcovers being reprinted as paperbacks. All Akutagawa winners are reprinted in Akutagawa Sho Zenshu, or the complete collection of Akutagawa Prize-winning works. And if an author and publisher get really financially lucky, a work attracts an international audience and gets translated into one or more additional languages to sell more copies. All of these reprints, of course, mean more money for the prize winner. The prize winner also gets a monetary award of 1 million yen. At the end of January 2025, that's about 6,500 US dollars, or 6,100 euros, or 5,100 British pounds. The conversions in the earlier Akutagawa Prize episode aren't wrong. Incidentally, the value of the yen has just changed a lot since 2023. The most important value of the Akutagawa Prize, though, is almost certainly the approval of the Akutagawa Prize Committee, their stamp of approval. Their stamp of approval means this is an author worth reading. Some of Japan's most popular literary fiction authors today are previous Akutagawa Prize winners, authors you might recognize, like Natsuko Imamura, Sayaka Murata, Hiroko Oyamada, Mieko Kawakami, Fuminori Nakamura, and that's just in the past 20 years. The committee usually includes some of Japan's most prominent authors of literary fiction, most often previous winners of the Akutagawa Prize themselves. I wasn't able to find out who served on the 1998 committee, but you'll probably recognize several of the names on the committee today, including Hiromi Kawakami, Mieko Kawakami, Yoko Ogawa, and Keiichiro Hirano himself. Early in Hirano's career as a writer, the editor-in-chief of Keiichiro Hirano's publisher advertised Hirano as the second coming of Yukio Mishima. According to Hirano, there were two reactions among the reading public. One was, "Oh yeah, sure, I could see that." After all, Hirano was heavily influenced by Mishima. On the other hand, some long-standing fans of Mishima thought the label was unforgivable. Hirano summarized their feelings as, "How dare they call him that?" It might be a little difficult for some English-language fans of Japanese fiction to imagine this. After all, Yukio Mishima is one of the most popular Japanese writers in English translation today. But Hirano observes that many Japanese readers in the 1990s thought of Mishima as a has-been. According to Hirano, for many readers, the god of literature, the literary hero in the 1990s, was Kenji Nakagami. Nakagami is an interesting guy, the only post-war Japanese writer to publicly out himself as a member of Japan's outcast buraku community. He's also the only out burakumen to have ever won the Akutagawa Prize. He won for his story The Cape, which is available in translation in the collection The Cape and Other Stories from the Japanese Ghetto, translated by Eve Zimmerman. I'd love to cover Nakagami in a future episode. Nakagami died of kidney cancer in 1992 when he was just 46. According to Hirano, he was almost a martyr to certain Japanese readers and literati. So Hirano thinks his editor called him the second coming of Mishima, not just to drum up sales, but also to make a statement about Hirano and about Japan's literary scene. Quote, "Hey, read this, and let's reflect on what was so great about Mishima's literature. Let's go back to an earlier age and reappreciate the literature of that time." I spent more time talking about Mishima with Hirano than I probably should have in a 1-hour interview because he has a lot of fascinating things to say on the subject. Hirano just published an analytical work of nonfiction called Theory on Yukio Mishima, on which he spent more than 2 decades. Sadly, it's not the kind of book that would generally be translated into English, but I'll definitely let you know if I find out it is going to be translated. You can read a transcript of my entire interview with Hirano on the RJL website, including more about Mishima. But as a brief aside, I'd like to read a quote from my interview that I thought was particularly noteworthy, and maybe especially relevant to those of us who aren't Japanese, but like to read and think about Japanese literature. This is a long quote. "What's really interesting is that those who love Mishima's literature try to ignore his political activism and try to brush it under the carpet, as it were. On the flip side, you also have all these conservatives, because he really became kind of a conservative himself late in life. The conservatives don't like to read his literature. But I feel like the two are intimately connected and should not be kept separate." And then he continued, quote, "So I just came to realize this kind of dichotomy and almost extreme separation because in the last 15 years, I had the honor and opportunity to be on panels at 3 very big international symposia on Mishima in Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo. As you probably know, Mishima yelled, 'Long live the emperor!' before committing seppuku. Mishima famously committed suicide as a political act at the end of his life. We've discussed it several times on the podcast. Yet all these foreign scholars never brought it up, and all they talked about was his literature. They completely ignored the fact that he was an imperialist to the day he died. That was really kind of jarring to me," Hirano said. "It really didn't sit well with me." As an English speaker who spends a lot of time commenting about Japanese literature, Hirano's observations really stood out, so I thought I'd pass them along. I also thought they might be relevant in this particular historical moment. As of 2025, Hirano has written more than 16 novels and short story collections. Including essay collections and works of nonfiction, he has published more than 40 books. As I mentioned earlier, his novels include A Man, At the End of the Matinee, Transparent Labyrinth. Most English readers would describe Transparent Labyrinth as a novella rather than as a novel. It's just 42 pages. And, of course, Eclipse. What's next for Hirano? Hirano plans to spend 2025 in New York City at Columbia University as a visiting scholar. He'll be working at the Donald Keene Center. He's also on the board of the Donald Keene Foundation. We've talked a lot about Donald Keene, although maybe it's been a while. Keene may be the guy in English language Japanese scholarship for most of the 20th century. He's a hugely impactful scholar of Japanese literature. Hirano describes him as, quote, an individual who really educated the English-speaking world about post-war Japanese literature. Keene also wrote an encyclopedic 4-volume history of Japanese literature series that ends with Yukio Mishima. I've used it often. My only real objection is that it more or less ignores women writers after Murasaki Shikibu and The Tale of Genji. Otherwise, it's a fantastic resource. It turns out that Keene left behind about 1,000 letters, some he wrote, some written to him, and its correspondence between Keene and Japanese novelists and other writers. Hirano will be working on sorting and cataloging these letters. He's also excited to be in New York because, quote, Tokyo has become a little stuffy and stale, and he feels like he needs, quote, a breath of fresh air to get into a new environment and be stimulated. He also considers it a great opportunity for his 2 children. In New York, they can experience a diverse environment while they are still young enough to maybe learn from it. We're going to turn now to Eclipse. Let me add as a preface that Hirano, again, had entered Kyoto University, and he had entered with the intention of studying law. Hirano did not like the classes in the law department at Kyoto University. He did, however, enjoy his Western political philosophy class. Incidentally, my undergraduate degree is in political science with a concentration in Western political philosophy. I told you, Eclipse really is right up my alley. Hirano describes a 2-year course covering the pre-Socratics through Jacques Derrida. Medieval philosophy and theology are especially important in Eclipse. You'll see how a man learning these ideas is immediately turning around and playing with them and writing them into his novel. I'll introduce the important concepts, add a little bit as we go. If I were to summarize Eclipse in one sentence, this is how I'd do it. Eclipse is the fictional memoir of a Dominican friar named Nicholas who sets out to study pre-Christian philosophy and learns a lot more than he bargained for. The Dominicans are a religious order within the Catholic Church. It was founded in 1216 by Dominic de Guzman, more commonly known as Saint Dominic. An order in the Catholic Church is a kind of subgroup that lives by a stricter set of rules and a more specific set of teachings than the everyday Catholic on the street. Dominicans lived, and continue to live, according to the teachings of Dominic de Guzman. In fact, as recently as 2018, there were still more than 5,500 Dominican friars. Dominicans are also what's called a mendicant order. Mendicant is a fancy and, I suppose, a kind of extra polite word for beggar. Along with members of some other Catholic religious orders, Dominicans take vows of poverty and depend on the goodwill of the people to whom they preach. A male member of a mendicant order like the Dominicans is called a friar, from the Latin for brother, and not a monk. That's why Nicholas is a friar and not a monk. Nicholas also describes himself as a scholar priest and explains that he's exempt from duties such as mendicancy, begging, and the salvation of souls. Saying he's exempt from the salvation of souls is a kind of interesting, maybe slightly odd claim for a friar and someone who sets out to refute heresy. But anyway, Dominic de Guzman founded the Dominicans specifically to oppose heresy. Dominic was concerned about the heresy he thought was the biggest threat of his day, known widely as the Cathar movement, also known as the Albigensian movement for their base in Albi, France. And it wasn't just Dominic de Guzman who was interested in the Cathars. They also caught Hirano's imagination. Now, who were the Cathars? First of all, Cathars probably didn't call themselves Cathars or Albigensians. They usually called themselves good men or good women or good Christians. Catholic theologians during the Inquisition applied the term Cathar pretty broadly. Cathars were Gnostics. Catholic Christians consider Gnosticism the root of some of the oldest heresies in Christianity and also the root of Catharism. To vastly oversimplify, Gnostics believed material existence, the actual world we live in where we can touch and smell and see things, is flawed or evil or even not really real. Salvation comes from a sort of secret knowledge of a hidden God. Some of the first Gnostics were the Manichaeans, the great foes of Augustine of Hippo during the 3rd century. I'm mentioning the Manichaeans only because our protagonist, in fact, many Catholics in the Middle Ages, seems perfectly happy to use the terms Gnostic, Manichaean, and Cathar more or less interchangeably. It's just a word for heretic who thinks the material world is bad. The Cathars were a particular group of Gnostics who throve in northern Italy and southern France in the High Middle Ages. Or maybe they weren't a group. Today it's not clear if there was any central Cathar organization at all. Regardless, anyone suspected of Gnostic beliefs in 14th century northern Italy and southern France was labeled a Cathar and brutally butchered by the Catholic Church during the mid-1300s. Young Hirano was blown away by all of this. First, as a non-Christian, he was surprised to learn that Christianity put such a high value on the material world. In a talk at the Kinokuniya bookstore in New York City in November 2024, he said, "I had thought until this point that Christianity was an ascetic religion that taught the preeminence of the kingdom of God over the material world." Thomas Aquinas, who lived a generation after Dominic and remains the most famous Dominican theologian, quote, adopted Aristotelian philosophy, conceptualizing a vast, continuous hierarchy running from the material world to God, and theologically assigned value to the material world on the basis of a teleological worldview, a worldview that has a goal or an endpoint in mind. In other words, Hirano always thought Christianity said, spirit good, material world, body bad. And he was surprised to discover that's not actually what the Christian church teaches. It's so much not what the church teaches that they were willing to kill thousands and thousands of people over it. Secondly, Hirano empathized with the Cathars, but ultimately rejected their worldview. Amid the stifling social atmosphere of 90s Japan, Hirano said, "I sympathized with the despair of those attracted to the Cathars." He sympathized with the desire to give up on the world around us. However, he continued, as a young adult in my early 20s, as much as I was fed up with this world, I became convinced that there was no choice but to live within it. I wanted to live, I had to. Finally, and maybe most importantly, Hirano was also startled by the othering of the Cathars, by the way the medieval Catholic Church made them into an enemy during uncertain times. We'll come back to that in just a minute. So Eclipse opens with this friar, Nicholas, and he's recalling events of his early life as a student at the University of Paris in 1482. Nicholas's great academic interest is reconciling pagan, by which he really means ancient Greek, philosophy with Christian theology. The reconciliation of Greek philosophy with Christian theology was a going concern in medieval Catholic theology, especially in a school of thought called scholasticism. Thomas Aquinas, whom I mentioned just a minute ago, was probably the most notable scholastic. He became one of the two greatest theologians of the Catholic Church by remaking Aristotle for Catholics. But by the time Nicholas entered university, scholasticism had fallen rather out of vogue. Nicholas says he was, quote, regarded as a quaint and eccentric Thomist. That's a fancy word for a disciple of Thomas Aquinas. Regarded as a quaint and eccentric Thomist out of keeping with his youth. Hirano explained to me that there's a, quote, vague kind of wishy-washy overlap between Nicholas's appreciation of Aquinas and his own love of Mishima. Both of them were kind of quaint and eccentric for loving the work of somebody so much older and out of fashion. Early in his recollection, Nicholas travels from Paris to Lyon in search of an obscure pagan text. The Bishop of Lyon, who should be an entirely orthodox and trustworthy man, sends him on to a remote village to ask an alchemist for access to the alchemist's copy of this pagan text. In the remote village, Nicholas discovers a few things. One, the local church has a priest, but he's a useless drunk, not the man the bishop thought was in charge. 2, the village also already has a Dominican friar in town, and this Dominican friar is a true mendicant preacher. He's whipping many of the people in the village into a righteous fervor. We learn later that this Dominican friar is also an inquisitor. You may or may not have been expecting that. Anyone? Anyway, I imagine most people associate the Inquisition with the Spanish Inquisition of the Renaissance, but the Inquisition actually began in 12th century France as a response to the Cathars. And the third thing Nicholas discovers about this village is that not everything in the village is as it seems. Nicholas soon meets probably the most interesting character in the novel, or maybe the most important from a narrative standpoint, Pierre de Fay. De Fay is the alchemist. Nicholas is absolutely enthralled. He has never seen, quote, such greatness of spirit so clearly manifested in human form. It's an odd turn of phrase for a Christian who believes that their own God became a human being. Nevertheless, the friar has to question whether a man who practices alchemy can really be a man of Christian faith. Is the man he admires a heretic? Does admiring the man make him a heretic too? I thought I would need to include way more spoilers to fully capture the novel and why Hirano wrote it, but that hasn't turned out to be true. I get to leave the best secret here for you to discover for yourself. It's mind-blowing. And there's this just mind-blowing scene full of the contrasts that we talked about earlier that Hirano saw and loved and learned from Mishima. Hirano applies them to alchemy in this gorgeously written scene. Life and death, masculinity and femininity, youth and age, sin and sanctity, Christianity and paganism. Is this the perfection of alchemy practiced by a holy man? Or is this a heretical witch's Sabbath? I'm so glad I don't have to spoil it. Please read the book. It's wonderful. Ultimately, the question of whether Pierre is a heretic comes to a head. A series of terrible events rack the village, beginning with a deadly disease that reminds villagers painfully of the Black Death. There are also giants in the sky having sex, an exciting kind of sex that good 14th century Christians might not have attempted on their own. The Dominican inquisitor begins looking for the culprit with new zeal, eventually settling on a character associated with Pierre and his alchemy. That character is burned at the stake in a lengthy, gorgeously metaphorical scene. When the body is gone, Pierre finds a reddish lump of gold among what remains. Just as quickly, it crumbles. And Pierre holds it in his hand and sadly says, "It's nothing but ash, nothing but..." And then he's quickly arrested. We, the reader, are left to ponder all of this. How much of what came before was just a part of Pierre's alchemical experiments? How much might have been something satanic? How much might have been something holy? Nicholas himself never decides. And really, Hirano leaves it up to us as the readers as well. The end of the book returns to the frame narrative. Nicholas gives us an update on some of the characters and what happened to them after the burning. There's no need for me to spoil that for you either. In that talk at Kinokuniya, Keiichiro Hirano identified 3 important allegorical elements in his story. Really, quote, 3 responses to the crumbling world of the late Middle Ages that he read or incorporated into his book in an allegorical way. First, one response to the upheaval of the late Middle Ages was the Inquisition and witch trials. Quote, "When the values essential to sustain a community are significantly shaken, we work to maintain our group identity by treating some heterogeneous, different than us, elements as evil and trying to expose or exclude them. We try to other someone instead of learning to get along when our values are questioned." He continues, "Rather than come face to face with each other, which forces us to acknowledge our conflicting values and may cause rupture, we fixate on one thing antagonistically and thereby distract ourselves from the differences between us and our neighbors. Instead of talking through our differences, we pick somebody else to be our enemy." Hirano describes this as, quote, "a hollow and often extremely harmful solidarity which can also be observed in contemporary politics. The yearning to eliminate and purify evil from the bodily and material world manifested in the Middle Ages as the torture carried out in witch trials. In other words, at a moment of great upheaval, it's easier to look for a common enemy than it is to have difficult conversations about how we might fix our own community and our society." Another response to the upheaval of the late Middle Ages was alchemy, which Hirano defends as more than, quote, "a ridiculous attempt to turn base matter into gold." In practice, Hirano says it's, quote, "the process aimed not to directly transmute matter, but to create a philosopher's stone that would make such transmutation possible." Hirano thinks the philosopher's stone is as much a symbol as anything else. It's, quote, "a tool for endowing the worthless material world with value." Actually, Hirano went on that he hoped in the manner of the alchemist to endow reality with value through language, and that he wanted his novel to become, for readers, a space of mystical experience that transcends the oppressive weight of life. And then finally, Europeans responded to the upheaval of the late Middle Ages with mysticism, which involves experiences of oneness with God that transcend both the body and the material world. Hirano concluded these 3 responses to the crumbling world of the late Middle Ages, attempts to purify reality, to value reality, and to transcend reality, enthralled me as I anguished over how to lead my life in Japan near the end of the millennium. But what exactly is the connection here? Let me start with a little bit of context about 1482. Some historians regard the period between 1000 and 1300 as the High Middle Ages. The 2 centuries that followed, the Late Middle Ages, were a long and difficult period of cultural transition. Because of the Great Famine of 1315 and the Black Death of 1347, the population of Europe may have fallen by half during the beginning of the Late Middle Ages. It was only around 1500 that population numbers again reached the same level as they'd been in 1300. The late Middle Ages saw massive numbers of peasant revolts and popular uprisings. The Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, and in many ways a sort of uber leader of Europe, was in exile from his home in Rome for large parts of the 14th century. There were multiple anti-popes from 1378 to 1417. Muslims took control of the Christian city of Constantinople in 1453. Less than 30 years before this novel takes place. At least in the US, we forget that Byzantium was actually the Eastern Roman Empire, and that it outlived the Western Roman Empire by more than 1,000 years. The fall of the Eastern Roman Empire was considered a major blow to Europe and to Christianity. It also cut off almost all European access to Asia and was one of the most important causes of the Age of Exploration. Eclipse takes place just a decade before Christopher Columbus's expedition to the Americas and about 15 years before Vasco da Gama made the voyage to the Indian subcontinent. So this was a period of soul-searching in Europe, a period that probably did feel like the end of the world. Hirano saw a lot of overlap between the end-of-the-world feeling he very reasonably imagined late medieval Europeans felt, and the way he and many of his peers felt in Japan in the early 1990s. To what we discussed earlier, let me add that Hirano noticed Japan had lost the most important of its common enemies at the beginning of the 1990s, first with the fall of the Soviet Union, and then with the end of the First Gulf War. According to Hirano, quote, "Mankind has been especially good at continuing to find that common enemy so that it can continue to maintain the peaceful status quo." That's what led to the othering of the people accused of witchcraft in the late Middle Ages, and it's something Hirano was acutely aware could happen again. Actually, there was a significant othering of members of new religious movements like Aum Shinrikyo starting in 1995. I'll come back to that in just a second. Like many, many members of the lost generation, indeed many Japanese people in general, Hirano was hit hard by the Kobe earthquake and the Aum Shinrikyo attacks on the Tokyo Underground. Several of the 10 men who carried out the attacks on the Tokyo Underground weren't that much older than Hirano. The youngest was 27 years old the day of the attack. So these men weren't directly affected by the employment ice age when they graduated from college, but they were by and large intelligent men in a position to influence Japanese society who nevertheless felt isolated from it. These are men who probably had the same sense that something in Japan had gone badly wrong. The Aum Shinrikyo attack in particular caused a crisis of identity for many Japanese people. Haruki Murakami wrote maybe the most famous account of Japanese feelings that's available in English in his 2-volume nonfiction work Underground, The Tokyo Gas Attack and the Japanese Psyche, translated into English by Alfred Birnbaum and Philip Gabriel. I should probably start out by noting that Murakami is about 26 years older than Hirano, so his feelings are generationally different, but the two men still have a lot in common. Murakami notes that he was motivated to write the work, quote, by a strong sense of fear that we, the Japanese, had still not begun to deal with, let alone solve, any of the fundamental issues arising from the gas attack. Specifically, for the people who are outside the main system of Japanese society, the young in particular, there remains no effective alternative or safety net. I should note that he's writing this book in the late 90s, a few years after the attacks took place. To a certain extent, Murakami demonstrates sympathy with the young men in Aum who carried out the attack, who, quote, couldn't help having some grave doubts about the inhumane, utilitarian gristmill of capitalism and the social system in which their own essence and efforts, even their own reasons for being, would be fruitlessly ground down. He does, of course, condemn their methods and their violence. But maybe the most important observation to me in the entire book is that Murakami concludes Aum isn't an us and them kind of a problem. Japan shouldn't and can't really other Aum. Aum was a decidedly Japanese organization created by the norms of Japanese society, populated by some of the people who had achieved the greatest accomplishments celebrated by Japanese society. Something about the vision of Japanese society that the Japanese assumed they shared had broken down, and it just wasn't working anymore. Murakami wasn't alone in his analysis, especially not in his sense that something was deeply wrong. There were lots of people who went soul-searching after the Aum attacks. Many members of the Lost Generation, many Japanese people in the mid and late 1990s were like Hirano, who, quote, no longer knew how he ought to live in this world. His desire to live was agonizingly intense, and yet he had lost all sight of the future. After Eclipse, Hirano's second novel tackled Japan's Meiji period, another end of an era that must have seemed almost cataclysmic to some of the people living through it. In Hirano's words, Tale of the First Moon, quote, depicts Japan's acceptance of modernization and romanticism through their friction with the Buddhist concept of emptiness. The translator's introduction to Eclipse describes the novel this way: set in 1897 in a central Japanese region of extreme natural beauty noted for its long and complex interaction between Shinto and Buddhism, Tale of the First Moon is the story of a young poet seeking a cure for his melancholia and a meditation on dreams, sorcery, and Buddhist philosophy. As of January 2025, that novel isn't available in translation. I certainly have my fingers crossed. So, why should we read the work of Keiichiro Hirano? Hirano is a powerful voice in the world of Japanese literary fiction. He has a seat on the Akutagawa Prize Committee for a reason. He's also a thoughtful writer whose novels are always full of ideas, even novels that are less opaque than Eclipse. He's also an innovative writer. Like some of my favorite authors, his oeuvre transcends genre and narrative patterns. Every Hirano story I've read is something completely different. I also want to make a case for why Eclipse is an especially timely read for English language readers. I've spoken before about my first forays into Japanese fiction, especially Mariko Ohara's novel Hybrid Child, translated into English by Jodi Beck. It's a truly bizarre sci-fi dystopian novel about a male-coded sentient robot who chooses to become a female-coded sentient robot and then takes on a maternal AI system threatening what's left of humanity. Yes, my English language science fiction reading at the time was much more centered on space operas, but Ohara's novel still struck me as especially timely. I was shocked when I realized it was published in 1991. I was reading it in 2017, 2018. The more Japanese fiction I read, the more often I saw that pattern. Japanese fiction from the 1990s, at least what had been translated, seemed incredibly timely when I was reading it in the late 2010s. Some of these novels were written by members of the Lost Generation. Many more of them were written by authors born about a decade earlier who were my age in the 2010s when the Japanese economy collapsed. That's when I realized the US, and not just the US, was facing a set of circumstances that looked strikingly similar. I'm what I like to call an elder millennial. My peers graduated into their own employment ice age. And what caused it? Among other things, a massive real estate collapse. Keiichiro Hirano and other Japanese people started facing questions like, what does it mean to be Japanese if my country isn't number one anymore? And they started facing those questions in the early 90s. In many ways, Japanese fiction is 15 to 20 years ahead of English language fiction on dealing with this vital self-reflection. That makes it a valuable resource, as well as truly enjoyable and thoughtful and well-written fiction. Hirano's Eclipse is about the options that are available to us when it looks like the world around us is collapsing. It's one of the most powerful statements I've ever read about how uncomfortable and downright dangerous a collapsing world can be, especially if we go looking for an enemy instead of looking inside ourselves. I've been reading today from Keiichiro Hirano's Eclipse, translated by Brent Deschênes and Charles DeWolf. North Americans can buy their books through RJL's bookshop.org page to support the podcast, and you can buy Eclipse and almost all of Hirano's translated work on the Read Japanese Literature website. I've also been reading from an interview Hirano-san was gracious enough to grant me in November 2024. I'm enormously grateful not only to Hirano-san, but also to interpreter Mari Morimoto, Columbia University Press, and the Japan Foundation New York for making the interview possible. Finally, I've been making use as well of material from his talk earlier that week at Kinokuniya Bookstore in New York City. If you like what you hear on Read Japanese Literature or what you see on the Read Japanese Literature website, consider joining the Patreon for as little as $3 a month. All subscribers get early access and bonus content with every episode. I do the labor for Read Japanese Literature entirely unpaid, but it does cost about $90 a month just to keep the podcast, episode pages, website, book lists, etc. running and publicly visible. You can join the folks who help keep Read Japanese Literature running and ad-free at patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. Finally, a quick announcement. Our tech overlords have become increasingly awful, and so Read Japanese Literature is no longer available on either Instagram or Twitter. Our Facebook page is still up for now. I hope it is obvious that I will moderate heavily for any hate speech, especially against immigrants or LGBTQ folks, since Facebook is no longer doing that for us. It has never, ever been an issue, and I hope anyone who wishes to join the discussion there feels welcome. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast, and there are still many ways to stay in touch. As always, you can contact us through the website or Patreon. We love Blue Sky at readjapaneselit.bsky.social. We're on Facebook. Search for Read Japanese Literature or follow the link on the website contact page. And we're on YouTube /@Read Japanese Literature. Again, thank you to Keiichiro Hirano, Mari Morimoto, Columbia University Press, and the Japan Foundation New York. And thank you, as always, to producer Keim for today's music, KHAIMmusic.com.